If you knew you were going to die and you always are ready to meet the Lord, always be ready to meet the Lord, is a very important Christian concept. And that you will learn. You will love the people you're supposed to love. Your priorities will be different. And those people who have experienced near-death experiences or have had on the edge of death, they live the rest of their life knowing that's a possibility now, and they change their lives. That's one of our problems, I think, is that we don't focus on our death. And the fact that we will meet the Lord someday, and this whole thing is about meeting the Lord. And what's also more important is that St. Paul says this. So I'm not talking about this religious fanatic in the 15th century. We're talking about what our Gospels and Paul's letters say. Paul says, look, Lord, you can take me today. It will be okay. You can take me or not. It doesn't matter, because whether I live or I die, I belong to you. And that's all that matters. So I'm living my eternal life starts at the day of my baptism, and there will be a day when I will transition into eternal life, and that will be a glorious day when it happens. So I'll tell people sometime, as like, look, whenever the Lord takes me, it will be okay. I'm ready. I want to go see God. I want because it's going to happen anyway, and it's time for me to be with God anytime He decides. But I'm not going to kill myself, right? And I love this life He's given me and all the things. However, I'm never attached to them. They never have hooks in me, because I can be as free as leaving it all tomorrow. And that's a spiritual life. That's a spiritual concept, in the Christian life. We have a question? Right. So he's saying whether you love this life, for those online, whether you love this life or the love the next life, and the fear of death is oftentimes an over-attachment to this world. However, it's also very human, right? And we say it's that the fear of death is the result of sin, right? Because we're saying there's a lot of discussion theologically. So just give that before I get into here, because this is the concept that's important about understanding this, is that the question has always been, would we have died if there had never been the fall? Because one of the things that we see from the Bible is that with the fall came death. The only problem is, reasonably now, all the people couldn't fit in the world that had ever fit. So somehow there would have been a death. And where do we need to look? We need to look at the Blessed Mother, because we say she was without sin, and so our theology says that for her, in the Eastern Church, it's a dormition. She fell asleep. Or we say the transition, or that we say the Assumption, in the fact that we would say that this is a transition. It's riddled with pain and scariness and fear because of sin in our life. If we would say we were without sin, we would fall asleep and enter into eternal life without fear and terror and all of that. So that what sin has called death is that separation, where without sin it would have been a transition, a welcoming. It's time for me to go meet the Lord. Oh, that's wonderful. I'll be there in a few years. I'll see you again. That's not what we think, right? It's more riddled with anxiety and fear and trepidation and all of that. Yes? Right. We're curious whether we're going to make it to heaven, and that's usually because, that's what his question was, and that's because we sin, and we know our separation from God. We feel separated from God. But remember that sin, that's what sin is a separation from God. But if we were never separated from God in this life, then there would be just a transition. That's why even we say, when you look at St. Francis, they talk about the transitus, right? The transition, because he was a saint, that he just transitioned into the next life, right? So anyway, right. Call us to be fearful of what will happen, and that's why. But focusing on your death is a Christian concept that is, when done well, not done in dysfunction, but done well, that talks about the fact that I will die one day. I will meet my Lord. Therefore, I must live today as well for my end. And that's one of the things I often bring up with it in theology, in philosophy. We talk about teleology. Teleology is the study of the end. That how you want to know your meaning is you look to the end purpose of it. And that's something that you figure out in reasoning. So if you want to know what is this good for, like pesticides, you look for its end. That's its purpose, is what's its final end. So we would say teleology is study of the end, what everything is pointing to. We'd say that my life is pointing to eternal life with God. Therefore, that's my end. So if that's my end, then I must study and live in such a way that that end becomes the reality for which I am destined to be. If I don't live toward my end, I would say I am not being who I am supposed to be, because that's where I'm supposed to be headed. All right? And that's where we say, when you want to figure out human nature, the philosophy of human nature, what's our purpose and our being, look to the end to which we will be. Does that make sense? All right, that's a philosophical. Okay, great. So let's get to class, guys, for all those. And you got to bring that up a lot closer than that, because that just shows this big waistline, and I'm ready. And you need to come a lot closer, man. Maybe from here to here, we all you want to show, all right? There we go. Like, holy moly. I was looking at it like, I don't want to turn sideways. All right. So just to remind everybody that on the parish website, I update that every week. So if you want more information, you do want to go there. You go to our parish website, and it's this little thing which you had on the screen before. I designed it. I thought that looked really nice as the logo. And then when you get to the page, this is what it looks like. You'll want to sign up. You want to sign up for Flock Notes. If you have not signed up, as you know, I always do this. Sign up for Flock Notes. You're not signed up. You're not signed up, then you don't get what the information I'm trying to get out to everybody. This is the schedule that we have right now. The additional information that I have, and I added a new thing. Remember that, oh, by the way, this event's never canceled, because everybody goes online, and it will be wonderful that way. Then I did add another note class for here, so you want to take that. And I added the other, right in here is the class from last night. So you want to thank Tyler. Tyler Netto took the audio and the class slides, and he put them all together. So if you miss a class, you can go back and look at it because it's being recorded, right? I'm assuming he's recording it. And yes, it's got the little red light there. All right, and I put up my notes for this class. Now, it's filled with typos because I go back and I read them. But I don't have time to read them before I give them out to you, because then they'd be ready like 7 minutes before class. So what's better is you just get them, and if own is spelled W-O-N and it's supposed to be own, and you look at the system, it's not one, it's own. It's because I'm typing all this myself, and so you need to look at it that way. Okay? So anyway, the other thing is I also have the outline of all the classes as we teach. And remember that there's a recording. The recording is not word for word because it's the older translation, but you can listen to it. So we're now talking about pages 55 to 90. I'm going to finish up the last class and then take 55 to 90. And don't worry if you're behind schedule, because as you know, being behind schedule, you should read this book like the saints did, chapter for the rest of your life, a different chapter. That's the whole point. All right? So you guys ready? Let's get going. First, I'm going to go back to chapter 16 because I said it really fast yesterday, and I really, really didn't want to miss it, because I also changed the slide for the emails I got after the slide. All right? So remember that everyone has faults, and you have to put up with them until God makes that different. So God uses our faults to test our virtues and our patience, especially when you're dealing with the faults of others. And in dealing with the faults of others, I know I've spoken this before, but I did find 2 more slides. I had to get 2 more pictures because here's a guy who's complaining, nagging, and here's a nagging. So I got 2 women and 2 men, just to make sure that everybody felt included. That one of the things he says is that many make the mistake of nagging others. He says, if you have spoken about the fault a number of times to someone, do not make the mistake of nagging them. thinking that the more you tell them, the better they'll change. He said, God will bring the good that comes from it. So what you want to do gives you an opportunity to cultivate patience and to put up with other people's shortcomings. And to think about how much they have to put up with you. They have to put up with your shortcomings. It's not like you're perfect. And if you are, then we have to have a discussion if you think you are. Because we should have the imitation of John instead, right? If you're perfect. But instead, we have to recognize that people have to put up with your own. And oftentimes, how can you expect people to come up to your standards that you set for them if you yourself don't come up to those standards? Right? So oftentimes they'll say, I'm going to bring this up 1,000 times over, but I can't believe it. Look at her gossiping about me. Isn't that awful? Well, the question is, have you ever gossiped about anybody? That kind of thing. It's always great when someone else, it's always easy to talk about someone else. And I brought it up the last time about passing a yellow light, pressing the pedal. It's always right for me to do that when I want to sneak right by that very long light that's in front of the credit union when I'm coming in off the side. So I come bailing around the corner because then I don't, but let me see someone else who's bailing around the corner. And I'm like, wow. Who taught him how to drive? Who taught him how to? Because we usually don't hold ourselves oftentimes up to the expectation that we give other people. And that's very difficult. So we want everyone usually to be perfect except us. Others need to be spoken of and corrected, but we hate to be called out. And there's no question. Oftentimes, you need to hear this. So your husbands and wives do this. But don't let them tell you something that you need to also work on. So rules are usually for everyone else. But God, he says that God doesn't want everyone to be perfect because he's not done it. And he has the power to do it. So he hasn't done it. So why would he not do it? And he would say that God wants you to learn to bear the burdens of each other's faults. That's a good thing. That you have to put up with that annoying spouse because it's going to get you to heaven or send you to hell. But whichever one it's going to do, hopefully, if you're going to imitate Christ, it's going to make you a holier person. And there's more to come up with that. But anyway, so the test of a man's quality is when he cannot have his own way. Or her own way. That you can test how well you are if you can't have your own way. What do you do when you can't? The occasion of sins do not overpower us. They usually just only prove our worth. So the occasions and temptations of sin when you don't have your own way and how you react shows you who you are. One of the things I remember a priest that I had been assigned to early on, he had made a decision, and he was a military guy, Navy, so he made a decision. The person went ballistic, talked about him. It was disastrous, a little crisis in the parish about letting her go, and then he said to me, he said, what I learned in the military? He said, sometimes you don't know if you're making the right decision. But sometimes what you do is you make the decision, and then it shows you made the right decision, right? So, but in his ability to say, no, I'm going to trust and make the right decision, what came after and how she reacted proved who she really was. It showed that she was really a nasty person, and that was probably the best thing to do, was to get rid of her. But what happened was it was the difficulty she had to face that showed her who she was. And she showed who she was to us. So sometimes when you spout off and everything, you don't get your own way, even like at the grocery store, and you watch somebody, and what it's doing is it's revealing their character. And they would say, well, I wouldn't be this way if they did the right thing. And I'm like, well, no, your character doesn't get shown when everything is perfect. Your character gets shown when it's tested. When you have the choice to act another way and you act that way. that shows you who you are, for good or for bad. And that's a very important thing for self-understanding. So he talks about, in the life of a monastery. I got this picture because I think it can make the connection to marriage. He says, remembering that the church is in a bad state when he's writing, and the seminary and the monastery is in a bad state, religious life is in a bad state. So he's making, and the clerics especially. So he talks about entering community, and you live there to live in community, or to enter into marriage without reproach. I think that's clear. The marriage equivalent, that it's not the externals but the internals of dying to your own self, your own inclinations, and focusing on God. That's going to be the salvation of your soul. In your own family, the dying to yourself in your marriage. I always tell them, look, when they're getting married, I said, the image you have is Christ on the cross. That's the image that you have to reflect in your sacrament, because all the sacraments reflect the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And I was like, so there will be suffering and death and dying to yourself in your marriage. I said, when one does it, it's called abuse. But when both do it, it's called a sacrament. Right? When both die to themselves, they resemble most beautifully kind of the offering of the Eucharist and the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, and the new life that comes when both sacrifice themselves. Right? But when one is a taker only and is not a sacrificer, then it's usually a disastrous relationship. But the reason why I have this picture here is this one and this one, just assume now that they're the same person, the same people. See, it says one of the things is that when you first focus on religious life and the hard work and the life, when you start, it's magical and you're willing to do all kinds of things. But as time goes on, usually you cool off. I was talking about that with because sooner or later, you love he's talking about with the religious community, you love the community, willing to sacrifice, but then as time goes on, usually you can't deal with the community anymore. You're bothered by the people in it. So a husband and wife, they love each other. There was a time when they loved each other, but after a while, they can't stand each other. And it's like, what happened in that relationship? What was going on? And religion, he said, when someone's founding a community, it was so wonderful. They had a lot of holy sacrifices. They did a lot of things for each other. And yet, as time goes on, all of that falls apart. So you become half-hearted, lukewarm. You lose your enthusiasm for the sacrament or for the family life. And he said that becomes the problem. And for me, it was the people who leave the seminary or in a parish. I think one of the things that happens, reading this up again, is that I used to do seminary faculty formation for guys thinking about becoming priests. And what was very clear to us a lot of times is the guy in front of me had a lot of problems. He came from a difficult family or something. And his anger or hatred was always projected on us because we were the crazy people. We were the mean people. We were the seminary's all screwed up and those faculty members are all screwed up. And then they would pack up their bags and they would leave, and I'm like, good. The two things. One, you're packing up all of your troubles and you're going with them. They're going to follow you because you aren't dealing with them. And instead you're pushing them out on everybody else. Right? So pack up your stuff, you leave. And the other thing is, oftentimes you're the cause of all the drama that we have. You're the one that's causing a lot of this, and that it could be different. So we will have a much more peaceful life once you're gone, right? Now that's a hard thing for to say, was how dare you think that? But sometimes when you think about it, even in marriages and in relationships and in families, when you're out pointing the finger at everybody else who's screwed up in this life, sometimes when everybody's out of step, when Johnny thinks everybody's out of step, something might be wrong with Johnny, right? And that's often the problem when you're dealing with something, because self-awareness is not there. And so when you try to say, well, maybe it might be you, the way you're dealing with it, it's almost impossible because people aren't open to seeing that maybe they might be the cause of the reason why this thing is falling apart. That maybe this might be the cause why you're not getting a whole lot out of community life, or that the marriage is falling apart. And one of the things I learned with a couple, if you want to have a disastrous discussion among couples, is when they're sitting in front of me, and all I'm doing is just asking, because I say, how could you do marriage counseling? I mean, you're not been married. I say, look, by the time they come and sit in my seat, I'm just trying to teach them to be Christian. Because they've usually gotten so bad by the time they're coming to see me that they need to be a better person, usually. But I will say something like, so what's your contribution to the problem? You know how little I get back about. They're very clear why that person on the other side of the couch is the problem, but they could never see their own, even the way they react. Could you react differently than that? Would that be something? And then it's usually like, no, the way I react is a proper response to the way I should react. And I'm like, maybe the gospel might say something else, but it's like telling a couple that should not get married that they shouldn't get married. That will never, it's like useless, right? They're always like, you should tell them they shouldn't get married. I'm like, yeah, that worked well in the past, huh? So it's like, it's obvious to everybody around, but the people sitting there. So I'm not going to say anything. It's like, are you sure? You sure this is, if you're acting, I used to say, if you're acting that way in front of me, what do you guys do in private? Because it's pretty awful watching it, So obviously it's got to be worse, usually, because you're showing me your best face, right? But my point in all of that is that the difficulty of taking responsibility for any of the actions, and it's like, you know what, I'm the one who did it, unless it's really, really obvious. But in the imitation of Christ is always talking about your self-awareness. I got a nice little slide coming up if I can get to it. The other thing that we talk about is I put all the slides in here: Charles Borromeo, Joan of Arc, Teresa of Lisieux, Mother Teresa, and St. Francis. Is really the idea of looking at the holy people who did a lot in their life for God, long before they died. Long before they even hit like elderly age, if some of them even did. Mother Teresa, the number of years of the good, and the other ones all died relatively young as far as we're concerned. And I remember a priest who said to me, sometimes when I read the lives of the saints and I talk about how they went to China and they did this, and then they're only 24 years old. I'm like, the amount of good that they did before they got my age. Some of them died younger than I was, and they've accomplished umpteen more for God than I ever did. And so he talks in chapter 18 about the examples of the Holy Fathers, the martyrs, the confessors, the virgins, all who went through a lot more than we ever did in our faith in terms of imitating Christ. And they left all the world behind, their family and friends. He says, why is it that we don't imitate these people like Mother Teresa? Or we honor them, right? We think it's a wonderful life that they have, but we don't imitate them. And so he asks that question, especially since they've done so much for God. They've done so much in living of the faith, and yet when we and he says, for us, all the time we take a look at our life, and we've lived a good 55 years, 60 years, and what have I really done for God in my time here? All right, and so he wants to take a look at the pious practices and suitable for a good Christian, a good follower of Christ. He says a monk, good follower of Christ. Most importantly, you can find the Gospels for this. Jesus talks about this a million times. The inward must always match what's going outward, right? There's no question. That duplicity is not, even when he was talking about Nathan, there is no duplicity in him. That the inward and the outward need to match. Unless, of course, your inward is filled with evil, then you don't want that to be the outward. But the idea is that as you're trying to move it inward and outward. So he says we can find a lot of excuses why we break our resolutions. A lot of excuses why we break our resolutions. So we challenge us every morning to depend upon God's grace. Now, if you get to this section on chapter 19, it should look a lot like Introduction to Devout Life, because he talks about, where you have to have resolutions, and you will have to, you don't omit your resolutions except for very good reasons, like works of charity and service, to take another one. And if you do have to forego your resolution this day, pick it up again very quickly the next morning. That you have resolutions in the morning in terms of your desire to be holy. So he says, collect your thoughts at least once a day. Every day, way back in a non-religious person like Socrates, an unexamined life is not worth living. That idea that you reflect, you have to take time every day. He says every morning and every evening. In the morning, you take time to review your resolutions to be a good person, to be a holy person. And in the evening, you take a look at what happened. So all those who come to us at night prayer, that the church always has an act of contrition. Well, it's on the I confess, the confiteor, but a little examination of conscience. Because he says, always you recollect your thoughts. So the phrase is recollect your thoughts at least once a day, every morning or evening. Morning is the time for resolutions. Evening is the time to analyze past behavior. What sort of person have you been today? What have you said or done? What have been your thoughts? Because it's in your thoughts and in your deeds. And in any of these ways, if you have offended God or your neighbor more often than you knew. So you have to think about and reflect on your life. That imitation of Christ, that's absolutely necessary. And then he talks about public prayer and private prayer. All right, and I'm the one who used the word public prayer, just to give you an idea. He says, after public prayer, which is the Mass, the Liturgy of the Hours, the morning prayer, the prayers that we do together as a community, right? He says, all that is done should be done in private. First, you do your Mass, you do the public things in public, but after that, rest of your life should be done and performed in private and in secret. He said, but don't go slack over community exercises and public prayer, because, Jesus says, go to your room, close the door, and talk to your Heavenly Father. So then people say, see, I don't have to go to church. However, that Jesus, just this past weekend, went into the synagogue, right? And he proclaimed the gospel, and the synagogue was a place of prayer and reading of scripture of the Old Testament. So, of course, he himself, and he went to the temple. So the public prayer is a standard part of Christ's life and our life. However, after that, he says, you would then have your intimate relationship with God. So he says, do not grow slack over community exercises and public prayer, which is what the Mass most like for most of you would be. He says, they come first. Your attendance, that's it, is clearly. And then what is left over is done as private devotion. Rosaries, Stations of the Cross, these kinds of things that you do for private devotion, your reading. That's for your own private devotion, not for the world to see. It's your time with the Lord. And he says that not everyone does the same thing. People are different, and they have different fits, different kinds of people, and they appeal one to another. And it's really hard when someone becomes Catholic or someone grows in their spiritual life. What they want to do is do everything that someone else is doing. And oftentimes, if they're in spiritual direction, we have to say, well, let's see what fits you, what fits your personality. And that's what he's trying to say. In the imitation of Christ in your private devotions, people have different ones. He says, what's more different is, So anyway, what comes first, what do I have? He said, not everyone has the same. People are different, and one kind fits and appeals to one over another. And I think that's important. And then pay attention. He wants you, if you're going to imitate Christ, to pay attention there in that chapter 19 about the seasons. So how you live Christmas, Easter, and Lent, and Advent are very important in terms of devotion. And then this is what's very important too when I talk about with people. He says, if a kind or a type of prayer, so private prayers, devotions, do not benefit you, move on to something else. Maybe it's just not to benefit you yet, but it'll benefit you later. So some people say, I don't get anything out of the rosary. And I'm like, okay, well then let's put it down. Maybe that's not where you are right now. But you don't say that the rosary will never ever be a benefit to you, because I bet maybe in a little while it might be. So he's trying to give, I think, a very human kind of experience of prayer, very broad, that you can choose many different things. And if it doesn't benefit you, it's okay. There's no, I don't like Lectio Divina, let's say. That's all right. Maybe you're just not there yet. So move on. But it doesn't matter what life you want to live, silence has to be a part of your life. The love of solitude, the love of silence in your life. Even Mother Teresa, I found this quote when I was looking at it, I thought it was really cute. I mean, not cute, but, beautiful. Beautifully cute, put it that way. He says, we need silence. She says, we need silence to be alone with God, to speak to him, to listen to him, to ponder his words deep in our hearts. We need to be alone with God in silence to be renewed and transformed. Silence gives us a new outlook on life. In it, we are filled with the energy of God himself that makes us do all things with joy. And of course, she would be right in line with the imitation of Christ, because he says you must refine, be alone, waiting upon God. Keep your mouth shut more than talk, right? And say without saying too much. Be with Jesus away from the crowd. As Jesus left the crowd, went up the mountain, you too must leave the noisiness of your life. Find some place in your house, somewhere where you can be alone with God. It says, do not be in public unless you love solitude. And this is where he talks about this. Look, the best people who are in public are the people who love solitude, not the people who are, who love to be in front of everybody and all of that, but the ones who love to be alone with the Lord. They're the best people in public. And then he goes on, the best people you want to talk to are the people who love silence. It seems odd. That's what he gives. It's like, you know what? Don't talk to the one who talks a lot, because they're probably just talking a lot, like I'm talking a lot right now. So don't talk to me, right? Talk to someone who loves silence, who listens to the silence, listens to God. That's going to be a good cue. He says, come to the front. Don't enjoy people who love to come to the front unless they love being in the background. They say, well, I like to be in the background. I'm like, well, if you want to do the imitation of Christ, you're the best person to be up front, because you're not doing it for any other thing than God's glory for what's needed of you. But you love the background, and you just rather stay there. But this is what I'm called to do. You will probably be the best, and you will trust in God's grace above all else. And he said, the best people who give orders are the ones who know how to follow them. And I think that it's just, to me, it's like, of course, that's common sense. Those who are the best to give orders are the ones who will always follow their orders of others. They know what it's like to give orders. And so they said the confidence of the saints come from knowing their place and humility. The greatest people of all, what we call the greatest people of all time, in our world, in our culture. I just threw that out. He says, the highest of the world's estimation they have the greatest danger, because oftentimes what in our world consider the great people is that they have a lot of sure confidence, and they're very sure of themselves as opposed to God. I'm not saying all of these people, by the way, I shouldn't show those pictures like that, but I just found the slide, put it that way, right? So, but he said all those people who have the world esteems as great, often they're very sure of themselves and filled with themselves. He said, but instead, you should love your solitude and your silence and your time alone with God. Because in silence, hidden truths are revealed, especially in Scripture. So do not go out much. Don't go out all over the town. People love to be out every Friday night and all that stuff. That would not be one who is, let's say, fostering a spiritual life, but one who loves to be close to God. And I love it. So don't go out much, but keep God close. Spend more time with God And he says, and friends and cronies, which I thought that's an interesting translation because obviously it wasn't written in English. But he wrote cronies. I don't know what the Latin would be of that. He said, keep them at a distance. And it's not saying that you shouldn't be close to your friends, but no one should be as close to you as God is close to you, as God as you have. Share your solitude with Jesus. And he said, why would you leave the solitude for gossip or for a losing of your peace of mind? So something very true that happens, you end up and you have such peace, and then you end up in the world of your friends and gossip, and you lose that sense of peace that you had. And he's saying, well, to maintain that peace, restrict the number of times you're out there. People would be very different. You can see that they would argue about this all the time. And then they go and see with their holy friends, and then that's great. But chances are it's going to be filled with God as well. All right? So that's why. So there we go. What happens after death? Heaven, hell, purgatory, right? So what we talked about before. It says, so a sorrowful heart is a key to many blessings. This is not our world. If you don't like what I'm going to say, all I'm going to say is that just listen to it, be challenged by it. Chances are you've been formed by the world, and the world does not believe this. And this has been around for 500 years, and it's still around, and people are still doing it, reading it. So lack the seriousness of mind and the carelessness of the false. To be lacking that seriousness, and the carelessness of not taking care of your faults, he says, sort of deadens the sense of the soul, which we can have. And if you're not going to pay attention to any of your virtues and vices, fostering your virtues and eliminating your vices, then no wonder. He says, you must form habits, must be formed if you want to overcome habits. So don't make other people's business your business. Gossip is the number one thing. And I've been really sensitive to that because I've been reading all this stuff, and of course I write it and I find a slide of it and all that stuff. And I'm like, holy moly, I just gossiped. I didn't have to say that. Anyway, it's amazing. So and you're right. I'd have be quiet a lot more if I followed this. So don't make other people's business your business. And don't worry if people do not think much of you at all. And that's a common theme, because you will see that there is not much that is free of trouble in this world. That our sins are the real ground of our regret, our habits that keep us from thinking of heavenly things. This is the sorrow that we have. Think of your death. That's what's important. And you will amend your life. So that's kind of what we talked about before. You will change your life if you're thinking about death. If you think of hell and purgatory, you will be more ready to put up with the difficulties and the sufferings of this life and the hardships, because they would not terrify you, because you know where you're headed. You're not a citizen of this earth. We're citizens of heaven now because of our baptism. So we can love the things of this world, and that is why he says there is no fire or energy in us, because we love the world too much. That's kind of where the slide is. So the view of man's misery. So everybody has troubles, he says. Many can't endure all that they have in their troubled life, so they complain, which is classic. But he says, man's happiness, your happiness, does not consist in having the earthly possessions. Right? We know that. This should sound so much like Jesus. I mean, you shouldn't be surprised by any of this. Right? There are people who, they so cling to life that they think their lives are forever. He says, the saints have been indifferent about the things of this earth. Now is the time to change, because your life is short. Right? And in all that, and I thought that was kind of a cute slide. You didn't put the slide up there, big guy. Oh, there you go. See, it's not a cute slide. But he says, your life, this is how short your life is. And so reflect on that, on how short it really is, and all that we do should be based on the fact that we will die one day. No fear of death if you have a quiet conscience. And that's what he's going to talk about, a conscience. Now, a lot of people, you have to have a formed conscience, but once you believe you have a formed conscience in the gospel, then there is no guarantee that there will be a tomorrow. The longer your life is, he says, the more sins you can commit. Right? I bet you some of you old people, you've been around for a while. You must have really had some time to commit some sins. Years pass, he says, and and think about all the years you're passing. He wants to ask you, all the years that you've been a Christian, what do you have to show for it? Just a question for reflection. For everybody here, it'll be different, but I thought that was a nice, easy question. Living longer in life is dangerous for us because we can sin more. So many die, he says, suddenly, and I put the slide up, so I don't want to offend anybody, but very sad, right? So you have a couple who's crying over the death of a child, or you have what I have is a woman, a young woman who's the death of someone, and then a child, and we're just going to assume that that's her husband or his father. And he said, many die suddenly. They just die, and we regret how carelessly that they live their lives. And he says, this is how you will die with confidence. Despise the world, long for holiness, love discipline, take penance seriously, obey readily, God, obviously, renounce yourself, and put up with the difficulties for the love of Christ. And he says, you will be ready when illness comes if you live this way, no matter what kind of illness life. He says, take your opportunity to change now. And there'll be a time that you wished for another day. Just one more day. So focus on it now, and he says you'll be free from anxiety and pain later. You live a good life now in a clean conscience. When sickness comes your way, you will live, and you'll be ready to prepare for it. Now, he says, live today like you will meet death with a smile. That was interesting. This is a quote he has, and I wanted to say, nothing commoner than can be told in the course of conversation how such a man was stabbed, such a man was drowned, how one fell from the heights and broke his neck. Another never rose from the table. Another never finished his game of dice. Fire and sword, plague and murderous attack, it is always the same thing. Death is a common end that awaits us all, and life can pass suddenly, like a shadow when the sun goes in. I think it's not to be morbid, not to be dead, but to kind of speak about the truth, live in the truth. Right? And how many of us know of a person who had a brain aneurysm at breakfast, right? It happens, and all of a sudden, you never said goodbye, right? It just happened. Or someone got run over, or someone, had a heart attack, and you never saw him again. That is part of what life is. And one of the things I think, what I like is that live in the truth. Don't deny these things, and you will live the way life is supposed to be lived. It says, instead, what we do is we hoard up riches, and we think they will last us to eternity, that this will be forever. And it's not. It said, but think about judgment and how sinners are punished. When you meet God, he will judge and know everything. You can't hide anything or give excuses. You will live in the truth then. So it's important that you become a person who can put up with things now. He says, if you are wronged, focus on the sin and not on the wrong being done to you. Be always ready to pray for your enemies. That sounds like Jesus. Forgive injuries. That sounds like Jesus from your heart. Forgive them, Lord. They do not know what they're doing. Quick to forgive others who move from anger to pity. And get rid of sin now. Prune it away. Prune it away, very much like Jesus. Prune away for greater growth the bad habits here in this life. The suffering in the next work in the world is fueled by the sins of this world. So each sin, he says, has an appropriate punishment, which I think is interesting how he does that. If you read like Dante's Inferno or the Divine Comedy, they talk about that. If he says, if in the eternal life you will see what true wisdom is. So Christ, the patience, rags are worn and fine clothes look shabby. He says the palaces shrink next to the poor man's cottage. Big palaces we live in, the poor little house of this man. Sounds a lot like Jesus. And obedience will be credited over this worldly wisdom. And of course, he's once again talking about how people think they're so smart. This world, everybody's so smart. They've all written books, and done YouTube videos. He says, but what's truly is one who's obedient to God. So sins, that they'll find it. So the eternal life, you'll see what true wisdom is. Philosophers will be less consoled than the good, clean conscience. So that's will matter. Devout prayers over good meals will be your comfort. So anyway, silence over idle chatting. That's what he talks about. So it's important. This is his advice, I think. It's important that you become a person who can put up with things. I think that's so tough. Not in our world. Nobody puts up with anything in our world today. All you have to do is just read the gosh darn letters to the editor or the comments on their website. I never read any of those anymore because they're all about people who can't put up with anything. So anyway, and this is a phrase I think he said, I have never heard this, and I just thought it was beautiful. Love is an unfailing passport to God's presence. And I found this thing called Passport to Heaven. What a picture. That's how the love that which you live this life, that's going to be your passport. That's going to be what you end up getting, using, which I thought was, at least I thought it was beautiful. Anyway, so, all right. So, now about the zeal that ought to amend your life. He says, if I only knew that I was going to persevere, and all at once he heard the divine answer in his heart, well, and if you did, what line of action would you propose to take? Should be a period there. If you take that line of action now, you will feel cheerful enough. Consoled by these words, he took to heart and resigned himself to God's will. And so all his troubles and flutterings came to an end. Gone those anguished speculations about the future. All he wanted to know about was God's will. So satisfying, so perfect in his design. The only real motive for starting out on any holy purpose or going through with it is God's will. That's motivating. And I just think that's kind of nice. And, one of the things that I try to tell people is because they will, if you go to seminary, right? I say, look, you're going to go to seminary, it's going to be God's will. But it's going to take 6 years to be a priest. I said, what do you care how long it will take if you're doing God's will? It's not about you becoming a priest. It's not about you doing what you want to do. It's about doing God's will. And God's will for you right now is to be in the seminary. That's where you be. And if it takes you 5, 10 years, as long as you die doing God's will, that's what matters. The same thing for all of us in the religious life, right? Whatever it is, as long as you are doing and you're obedient to God's will, it doesn't matter how long it's going to take. I say that with people who want an annulment. They're like, it's 9 months for a year to get an annulment. I'm like, you know what? If you don't start now, in a year from now, it's still going to be a year from now, because it's always going to be a year from now. So you might as well start now, and a year from now, it'll be over, right? The year now will be over. But I said, what difference does it make how long it's going to take, as long as you are always trying to do the good? As long as you're always doing God's will, it doesn't matter. And I think that is so true if we can get that in our life, because we have a utilitarian idea, and we have this idea that we need to accomplish these things. We need to get what we want. And it was like, look, if God so gives it to me, it's okay. If God doesn't give it to me and I die before I get a chance to have it, it is by God's will that I do it. That's a person who is truly free, right? Absolutely free, because it doesn't really matter anymore. Whatever it is that God wants of me. So, anyway, any questions so far? So he says, so many people keep back from the spiritual growth because they run away from difficulties. We do not like to struggle. We do not like to struggle. Those who progress in the fight for the spiritual advancement, and this is what I think is really key, are precisely the people who launch an attack just when it's going to be difficult. So I have this picture. I tried to find a picture of a person kind of standing before the big cliff. Before the big mountain. They're going to climb up this big mountain. He said, it's at that moment, just when the people who launch the attack, when it's going to be difficult in their life. Because it's there, he said, that's where the spiritual advancement will happen. And it's really hard because most of us prefer consolation, which of course we would. We want consolation. And when things are difficult, that's usually when we back off. And he says, that's precisely at the moment when you should attack, when it's going to be difficult. So for a real amendment of life, he said he offers you two things. Above all, you must wean yourself away from your faults, pretty obvious, and you must press on hard to pursue good qualities, the ones you most need. And the only way you will know these things is in the silence of your heart. God will reveal them to you. Those are the only things. Above all else, if you mark your life by these two things, you will do well. Habits. And the other thing he says is, look at the cross. Look at the crucifix. Often. He says, in his 15th century way, you should be ashamed that all these years in religion and so little attempt to make him your model. So meditate on a holy life and the passion of Jesus, and you will find all you need, and you don't need to look anywhere else. I think that's really important, I think, for me, my spiritual life, because one of the things that's hard, I think, is that we often won't put up with what we see Jesus has to put up with, right? And yet we praise that he put up with it. Give me an example that was a really big thing for me. Is that, the church goes through all kinds of things, and it gets some criticism, and I sometimes get some mocking, as a priest. In the greater world, you see it. It's not like we're held up as the greatest of professions, let's say. And so when I'm reading the paper and there's this nasty letter to the editor about me, or not about me, but about the church or about priests or whatever, or I happen to mistakenly read a comment because I got distracted to read it. And then first thing I want to get is all bristled up, like, how dare you say that about me, And that, don't you know? And then you have to look at the cross and say, could I expect anything less? Why would I think that Christ himself who experienced this, but I don't want to experience it. But yet I want to be a faithful follower of Christ. And I think that's true for all of us in the Christian life, is that we have to recognize that we're dealing with the world, and this is the way the world will react, and that you have to have a thick skin, because that's what Jesus needed, obviously, and he had. And we want to imitate him. So we ask for the graces to be like him, to carry the cross in the face of people who will spit in your face, and and that you will fall and pick back up. That the stations of the cross, very important. And I think that we have to expect the same things happening to Jesus, the kind of martyrdom that we have to experience, that he experienced. But yet we say, it's awful. Like, how dare they say that? So when they say even something, it's terrible that the culture pushed prayer out of the church, pushing God out of the public square. And I'm like, well, that's what they did with Christ, right? Why would you expect any different? That's the world we live in, and that's what we are called to engage in. And I think sometimes, I was dealing with this with a priest because, when you go down to Washington, faith is different all over the place. In New England, it's one of the worst in the United States, right? In terms of practicing and sort of people who go to church, New England. So when you go down to bigger cities, like when you go down to like Texas and you go to church there, filled with young people, right? They're building a school in Florida, and you're like, and we're up here, and you're like, man, do I have anybody who's Catholic with me? And I'm trying to find somebody, and I was closing a church, and we're selling all of the stuff to the people in Texas because they're building a new church there. It's like, what's happening? And so sometimes with priests, it's so much better to be there because, you've got big parishes and you've got big school and there's lots of people involved, And I said to the priest, I said, but don't you want to be where God needs you the most? I mean, I think that we have to be here because this is where there's a lot of work to be done. If I want to be coddled by, a lot of big churches and parishes like it used to be maybe in 1950s here, and it wasn't so much in the South for Catholics, then sure, you can want to be there. But to me, there's a sense of missionary place here. And it's not time to kind of whine and complain about the faith. It's time to do something. It's time to proclaim the gospel. It's time to bring the message of Christ to the world. But that's what happens is we want to retreat to where it's kind of safe and we live in our little bubble of Catholicism or so. But for me, it's like, well, that's when you look at the cross and you're like, yeah, that's right. That's what I'm asked to do. All of you are asked to do in your own lives as well. I don't know if that makes any sense. He says, how are you to get out of this or that difficulty or that embarrassing situation is God's business, not yours. After all, what harm can it do? Other people knowing about your weaknesses and taxing you and making fun of you and mocking you about your weaknesses. He says, often it's the best possible thing for you because it keeps you humble. And I think that's sometimes the freest people are the people who are no longer need to hide. You know all my weaknesses. This is who I am, and I don't have to put up another face for you. And he said, that's how I'll get out of this or that's God's business. I'm just going to try to be faithful to God as much as I can do. And in the last, it says that time comes to an end. Or he said, in terms of solitude, reaching the stage of refusing consolation. There we go. He said, freedom comes from making God's will and your neighbor's good your sole aim. So he talks about the two wings, which I thought, singleness of heart and purity. Purity more than just sexual, purity in all of your affections. Singleness of heart is for your intentions. Have one intention, to do God's will. And then with that, you always want to do for your neighbor's good. All right? And then I like this one here. I found a picture of someone trying to find someone who thinks of themselves a lot better than they really are. And sometimes we can do that. So let's try and do it says that, this idea how sometimes we think, and by the way, which goes along with this one, and this one, is you will find, I got to end this because it's 7:30 now, is that the ability for self-deception, I said before, is limitless. And the goal in the spiritual life that comes with silence is to know yourself. To know yourself. And Saint Teresa of Avila said, the way to God is through self-knowledge. So knowing your weaknesses, knowing your struggles, knowing your blessings, what you're good at, that kind of self-knowledge, which only comes through self-reflection and silence, and not pretending to be somebody you're not, he says, ultimately is where holiness and sacredness is going to be found. And it's going to be where you're closest to God. Right? If that makes any sense to you? All right. So anyway, I like this one here. One of the last thing, invite Jesus into your heart. I think I skipped over this one because he says, focus on the interior life, which is going to be part 2. Interior life where Christ comes to you. This picture was, I remember as a kid, that's why it's so important. You have to fill your house with sacred images. So look around. When I go to people's homes for dinner, so if you invite me for dinner, I'm going to do this. Look around, and I'm thinking, where are all the pictures of Jesus? Where's the shows that this is a Christian home? And I remember talking to one mother about that because I had gone to their house, and they were travelers, so they had picked up this big kind of Buddha, but it was a piece of artwork for them, Buddha, and it was there. And I said to her, where's Jesus? There's no picture of Jesus. There's no crucifix. She's like, oh my gosh, I don't know. I never thought of that. And so she went and she got a picture. She got a crucifix and she put it up on her wall in the dining room because dining room and living room were together. And she says, you know what? My daughter came home and she saw the crucifix on the wall. And she said, why did you put that up? She said, well, because we're Christian. And she said, but don't you think it's a little like in your face? And I'm like, but then she realized, right, the light went on, is that, these were absent for her. But I bring that up because I have in my mind, and I close my mind, I see that picture. I know right where that picture was in my grandmother's room, right? Because she had the picture of Jesus knocking on the door. And I grew up looking at the picture. She died when I was in 6th grade, so I was younger than 6th grade. Looking at that picture, thinking, Jesus knocks on the door of my soul, and I need to make room and let him in. Now, I didn't learn that from big books. I learned that from a picture that hung on my grandmother's wall. And that's why I think we gotta recapture some of that. So I think I go into people's homes and it looks much more like home interior decorating than it does, a Christian home. A Christian home that because you'll put what's important to you up on your walls. So he said, get your heart ready, make room for Christ, and shut the door on all the intruders that come in, right? And that take up your space. You don't want that. And he says, friends are good, but don't put too much confidence in your friends because they may not always be around. They were not all around for Jesus, right? They left him at the cross. So he says, and the world is not our country. We are foreigners here who are visiting and passing through. This is not our eternal home. And so I think that's important because it's about my good friends. And he's not saying don't have any friends. You don't want to take that to the extreme. But what you want to do is that human beings will always disappoint you. Your mother, your father, your brothers, your sisters, they will always disappoint you because they're human. Right? And that's built into the system. And when you put too much trust in them and you're disappointed, it's almost like it's your fault that you were disappointed because your first trust and confidence is always in God first and foremost. And he says, place yourself in his wounds and you will care little for the contempt of others. And you'll easily put up with the criticism that people give you because your focus is on Christ, right? If you love Jesus, you will put up with all kinds of contempt from others. And if you were all right yourself, and if you really have been ready, and if you've really been through the process of purification, you'd be able to turn to anything. You'd turn anything into a good account, and you'd profit by it. No question. A lot of things may get on your nerves because you never really died to yourself, never weaned yourself off earthly things. So if you find yourself, anybody, getting on your nerves, the problem is you, not the other one. And that's a hard thing. Yeah, see, you don't believe that, huh? Yeah, because it's amazing. I tell somebody, is that, I'm going to end with this. I think it's kind of true. When talking with someone, they're reacting to something, I always try to find out if the reaction is reasonable. Because if the reaction is overboard, for something, then something else is going on here, because it doesn't make any sense that he leaves the coffee cup on the counter and that makes you mad to a point where you're furious. Because that doesn't make any sense. Something else is going on here. What's wrong? What's wrong? But usually someone else looks at that and says, yeah, every morning he leaves his coffee cup in there, so I put it in the sink. Like, what's the big deal? It just infuriates me. And I was like, okay, so something's wrong with you. And I think that's a hard thing for us to understand, because if we get angry, if we're annoyed, if we're annoyed in line because at the grocery store because the person in front is messing all of the money up and she can't get it out and she's tried the card and it's not working and you're getting annoyed, that's your problem. Because you have no patience, you have no understanding, you haven't died to yourself yet. You're still too self-absorbed to be able to let those things go. And anyway, we'll pick up there on that happy note next time, all right?